Ambassador, we're suggesting in any way that we are better or superior or whatever to anybody else. It is simply that by virtue of our size, the nature of the problems we have fought to overcome, the contributions we have made in the world over the years, and so on, we have a useful role we can play. And that ultimately boils down to the kind of contribution we believe we can make. But you're totally right that in addition to the talk about the P5 and the Security Council and so on, there has to be a real focus on the international financial and economic institutions that so much affect the well-being of people of the world. And we have not spoken about regional cooperation. Global governance is not only at the totally universal level, there's tremendous amount of progress taking place at the regional level. And for example, that India's involvement with your own region, ASEAN, and our contributions by joining things like the East Asian Summit and the ASEAN Regional Forum, Shanghai Cooperation Organization will be an observer, and all of these things are a reflection of our understanding that there is a lot we can do through joining smaller groups. So my own pet story is the one of the Indian Ocean Rim Association. 18 countries, an organization none of you have ever heard of, but it straddles 3 continents and brings together countries whose only element in common is that they're washed by the waters of the Indian Ocean. But the potential for putting together a small group to do effective work together is so great. And then we have something like BIMSTEC, which brings in, as you know, Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, all together in an element of cooperation which cuts across boundaries, but in a sense creates a region where there was no sense of a region in the political or geopolitical sense before. So there is tremendous potential for that sort of cooperation. India is committed to doing its part. Turning to Mr. Klaus' questions, the notion that we have a lot to learn, we will never contest. There's a lot of improvement, certainly there is room for. But I do want to say that India is much more conscious than ever before of the need for change and expansion. For example, last year, before I joined government, 2 years ago now, 2008, the Cabinet approved a proposal to essentially double the size of our foreign service. And the reason it did so is an implicit acknowledgement of the fact that the size and functioning of our service in the context of today's 21st century demands and the widespread reach of the Indian presence is in fact too modest, and we need to do something about that. You mentioned the excessive focus on the neighborhood. Certainly to some degree that is a reality for us. We are not going to be able, I think, to play the kind of global role or indeed even the national role that we would like to play if we are constrained by limitations and failures in our own neighborhoods. We want to contribute to the growth and development of all our neighbors and rise above the immediate problems that distance us from one of them. But having said that, on the larger issue, you're totally right, we are trying to strengthen our institutions, and it's not just doubling the foreign service. We've started doing some very serious thinking and work on increasing the study of international relations, for example, in India, which is very limited at the moment. Is confined largely to a handful of campuses, area studies, and so on. There's no equivalent of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy or the Woodrow Wilson School or Johns Hopkins in the US or the HUEI in Geneva or even the LSE in London, other than the School of International Studies at JNU and to some degree the Department of International Relations in Jabalpur. There's a lot more that needs to be done, and I personally I'm committed to encouraging this. Every time I meet an educationist, I tell them, think about setting up a program in international relations, international affairs, and I think it's very important to enhance that. And the same thing applies to our think tanks. We're now creating a culture of think tanks, excessively centered in Delhi, but they're coming up, and if some of them can focus knowledgeably on problems beyond our immediate periphery, that would be very good. And finally, I just want to agree with you, because in my other speeches on domestic themes to our domestic audiences, I always stress that before we can speak in terms of being a great power globally, we absolutely have to solve our own internal problems. And that has been a fundamental issue. This was a specific topic we had discussed, global governance, and so the theme was very much a state-centered theme. But if you look internally, clearly we have to bring along the majority of our people. Indeed, I would even argue, and our Prime Minister has pretty effectively articulated this, that the fundamental purpose of our foreign policy is to help create conditions in India that will enable us to pull our people out of poverty and to focus on the development and well-being of our own people. So if we can do that, we can overcome not only the terror of the jihadists or the Naxalites or the Maoists that you mentioned, but also the daily terror of ill health, of hunger, poverty, of suffering, of unemployment, malnutrition. If we can overcome both kinds of terror, we will obviously be in a much, much better place on the world stage. And I just want to endorse the spirit behind your question. But I at the same time want to say that it's not that the countries that, for example, became the P5 in 1945 did so when they were completely free of problems. The US still had significant poverty. They still had the problems of the blacks in America who had not yet received their full democratic rights. They had the difficulties in Appalachia and inner cities and so on. But they were still acknowledged as a world power. So the mere fact that you have problems at home doesn't mean that you should not nonetheless play a significant role around the world. It's just that you have to be conscious of both, and certainly we in the government of India are. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor, for a superb lecture and also for answering all these questions so comprehensively. I think what has come out very clearly from this discussion is that in this postmodern world in which we live, the existing institutional mechanisms that we have are quite clearly anachronistic. But the problem is that you can't have global governance, which is obviously the key to having a credible roadmap in order to solve any of the problems on our agenda today, like climate change or weapons of mass destruction, etc. But unless global governance also accepts and adjusts to the new sort of power shifts in world politics, which, for example, the UN has refused to do, and therefore the UN continues to dilute its own possible relevance to solving international problems, it is not clear as to how a suitable paradigm or an adequate paradigm of global governance can emerge. And you can't have progress on critical global issues if it is held hostage to occasional sector-specific agreements between key countries, which is what is probably happening today, whether it is on trade-related issues or financial issues or climate change and so on. So I think the key question which was not sufficiently discussed because of lack of time is